From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Indiana Issues. Lots of things to talk about as Indiana lawmakers come back into session after the halftime break. And join us to talk about the big issues is our panel, Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. Brad, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Abdul.
Democrat Kip, too. Kip, good to have you here.
Great to be here.
And last but not least, Kyle Walker, former chairman of the Marion County Republican Party. Kyle, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Well, gentlemen, like I said, we got lots of stuff that the lawmakers had to deal with. Of course, one of the big issues is the issue of bias crimes. Will there or won't there be a list? Kip, you're there every day at the legislature. Where are we with the possibility of a list of enumerated protected classes?
Well, since the beginning, Brian Bosma, Speaker of the House, has kind of put cold water on a list. And so it came out of the Senate without the list, and going to the House where there was a chance, pretty good chance there wasn't going to be a list. I think getting to a list is going to take some really heavy lifting by the governor, by the Indy Chamber, and actually the state chamber reaching their membership across the state. I don't think there's been enough input from places like Evansville and Fort Wayne and the Louisville suburbs to really put pressure on those legislators so that they have an idea what the actual impact could be for economic development in this state. And I think it's significant that if we don't do it this time, it's going to be a pretty big black eye for the state of Indiana. We're one of only 5 states. The argument with respect to the list or no list, there's one state, Utah, who I believe is already going in and changing their statute because they have found that prosecutors cannot use the statute without a list to be successful in prosecuting a hate crime. So there's an argument out there. I don't think Bosma believes he has the votes right now in his caucus to be able to pass it. I would hope we would get rid of the Hastert rule. That's what stopped us in the Senate.
So a majority of the majority.
Yeah, it stopped us in the Senate. It'll stop us in the House. I don't know why we have a Hastert rule in the Indiana General Assembly. It doesn't make sense to me.
Brad, when you look at how this issue has been lobbied, so to speak, I think Kip brings up an interesting point about people, putting pressure on lawmakers. I remember during the whole RFRA issue, you had a lot of people, and even the CBD oil, it was personalized. You had people bring in a family member, bring in a veteran, bring in somebody that this isn't just sort of an abstract, issue of protected class. You actually had real people, and this I'm kind of surprised that has been more of that from sort of a lobbying perspective.
Yeah, I'm still not convinced that there's a large majority of people that feel that we even need to have a bias crime law. If we have it, I agree with Kip. There probably ought to be a list. That way it's enumerated so that a prosecutor does know, all right, who falls under this category. I don't think it's going to come out with one if they pass something.
Kyle, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the business interest of all of this, without a list, we're probably not going to, it's not going to rise to the level of getting us off of the list of states that don't have bias crimes protection. So from just a pure economics business interest, the tech community has come out very strongly against this, as have, there's 30.
You mean for a list?
I'm sorry. Yeah. For a list, as have, 30 some odd national groups for a variety of interests. I think to everyone else's point, it's probably a long shot at this point, but there's a lot of discussion still being had.
One of the things, gentlemen, anybody feel free to jump in on this. Something the governor told us right at the end of the first part of session, that there already is a list out there under the federal hate crime statute, sort of had some of the enumerated protected classes. Under the state civil rights code, there's an enumerated list, and even for reporting bias crimes in Indiana in the statute, that there's a list. So if we got all these lists out here, why does this seem to be such a hard road to toe?
Well, because there's one particular group on the list that there are people that who believe for religious reasons they shouldn't be on a list. That's really what it comes down to. I mean, you can talk about all the things you want to talk about, but that's really why we are at a sticking point in the state of Indiana, is because LGBTQ and transgender rights folks, there's a portion of the Republican Party who doesn't want to protect those people.
But that's what I guess maybe that's why the Howard Truman said, because sexual orientation is already included in a number of different things, not in the civil rights statute, but in reporting, sexual orientation is included. Ironically, gender is not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a variety of reasons why folks who don't want the list, what the rationale behind that decision is. I think that what often folks have said is that a list is, you can risk leaving some group off. There's a variety of reasons why that can be problematic. Ultimately, the federal list that the Governor Holcomb has suggested that we sort of mirror or reference to, maybe that is an elegant solution to this issue, but we'll see.
I just want to add one thing. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you. The idea here that if we leave somebody off the list, it's going to be a problem. The legislature meets every year. I mean, if someone's left off the list, we can fix that every year. I think that's a specious argument.
I want to ask you, Brad.
Specious.
One of the things that some folks will say is Indiana's doing extremely well. It's ranking near the top, with economic development, with job creation, and a low tax environment. And if Indiana's managed to do all this without a list, would a list really make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things?
I don't know that it makes a big difference in the scheme of things. I mean, a crime is a crime. Any sort of a crime against me is a crime regardless of whether you hate me because I'm a libertarian or I'm smarter than you guys or whatever the motivator is, a crime
It's
is
not
still
the last one.
a crime is still a crime. So at the end of the day, I don't think you're going to see people who are having crimes committed against them and the perpetrator going unprosecuted. So I don't think that that's going to be an issue, and I think this is more of a feel-good, but I don't know that it makes a whole lot of difference at the end of the day.
You're watching. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I understand that argument, but the issue here is that when you create the climate that you have, what happened up in Carmel this year, what happens when a cross gets burned on somebody's front lawn, creates a different environment, and that's what you're trying to punish so that there's a detriment there, and that does make a difference to every community that's affected by these kinds of crimes. And so I understand what the libertarian position is on it, but I just have to say that if you spend time in one of those communities and you are subject of a swastika on your synagogue, or you're a black person and the cross gets burned in your front porch area, you might have a different opinion as to what that is.
My grandmother had a cross burned in her front yard because they were Catholic. Trust me, I know. So, but again, it was still a crime.
You're watching Indiana Issues. Our guests today are Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Democrat Kip 2, Republican Kyle Walker, talking about the issues facing the Indiana General Assembly as lawmakers go into the second half. Gentlemen, teacher pay. The House has passed a teacher pay proposal. It includes the governor's proposal, freeing up some pension funds to put toward teacher salaries. The House has also sort of put together sort of a recommendation, so to speak, that schools spend 85% of their operating funds on the issue on teacher salaries. But regardless, there is no mandate. Is this something that can be done without a mandate? Unless you mandate the school district spend the extra dollars on teacher pay. I'll start with you, Kyle. Is there any guarantee that the new money will go actually toward teachers?
There's no guarantee, although it goes towards the longstanding tradition of having local control over our schools, and the legislature has identified this as an issue that they want to increase funding for, and have identified it as a priority. Now it's up to the local school boards to spend that money wisely and appropriately, and convert those dollars into increased pay for teachers.
Kip, is this something that can be done without a mandate?
Well, yeah, it can be done without a mandate, but there ought to be a mandate, in my judgment. I think
here's a frightening thought. You and I actually agree with each other.
Well, I think the Republican Party ought to listen to their Republican superintendent of public instruction, who was elected on this issue. And I find it humorous when we say, well, we don't, school, we ought to leave it up to the locals, I think is what you said, Kyle, with respect to education, and we don't. We just had the state take over the Muncie school system. We haven't taken over the Gary school system. We don't leave it to the locals on much of it at all, and we certainly don't anymore when we did tax caps. Leave the funding to the locals. It's really state controlled in almost every way, and so it's another. I'm going to use it again. Another specious argument.
That's a new word.
When we say let's just leave it up to the locals how they want to pay the teachers. I mean, it's a statewide problem. It's not isolated. Every community in the state's not paying their teachers enough, and that's because the state legislature isn't giving enough funding to public schools. That's the central problem.
Brad, once again, mandate or no mandate?
I'm a big fan of local control. However, on this issue, I agree with you and Kip. There needs to be a mandate. Sadly, for whatever reason, and I go back to Mitch Daniels saying, I don't know why government doesn't work. It just doesn't. I don't know why local school districts can't pay their teachers more. I just know they don't. And in this instance, if you're going to create more, if you're going to create more funding for schools, and the whole discussion centers around paying teachers more, then yes, mandate it for teacher pay.
Is this one of the situations, Kyle? I always jokingly say, and I think you can relate to this with teenage boys, that some days the only way to get them to do what they're supposed to do is mom and dad got to put a mandate down. Otherwise, it just ain't going to get done.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly understand the argument for the mandate. Again, I think that the General Assembly is reluctant to do that. They want to maintain local control. You mentioned several things that the legislature has done recently, state or property tax caps and the like. They don't mandate the spending of that. That is a mandate on what their limit of taxation can be for real estate. So, I mean, there are very few examples other than the two that you cited where there's actual state-run control of schools. And I think that opens up a much larger conversation and a much bigger can of worms if the state is truly going to be responsible for the decisions made by local school districts.
I know there have been some talk about would Indiana teachers sort of walk off the job, do what we've seen in places like West Virginia or Oklahoma. As we tape this program, there's a weekend rallies at the State House by ISSA. I think there's another one in April by the AFT. Are we at the point where Indiana teachers are going to start maybe walking off the job or calling in sick, and will that maybe shake things up somewhat?
I think bigger issue right now, a lot of districts are having problems even getting subs to come in. And it's just subs aren't paid well, and they're part of that teacher pool. And I think that's going to manifest itself, that we're seeing a lot of talented individuals come out of our colleges and universities who are choosing not to go into education for economic reasons. And I think that's going to bite us soon.
Kip, what do you think?
I think if nothing's done, you will see blue days or whatever we want to call them. I think it's illegal in the state of Indiana to go on strike, but I don't think that's going to prevent some sort of job action here in the future if something isn't done, and that doesn't help the situation really for anybody. When those things kind of happen, the parents aren't served well, the kids certainly aren't well taken care of in that situation, and of course, it's not good for the teachers as well, not to have to be standing on a picket line.
Kyle, one of the things that I find interesting about also this teacher pay issue is what exactly is good teacher pay. Obviously, where you live, what your bills are, dictates your salary. A teacher in Hamilton County probably does a little bit better than somebody in Danville. Probably does better than somebody say in Paoli or Winchester. We also hear the numbers that Indiana teachers are some of the lowest paid in the country. But when you factor in cost of living, then the number kind of goes up a bit. What is a person to believe on this issue of teacher pay? I
mean, it's totally relative. It again, to your point, if you live in Indianapolis or Hamilton County, your cost of living is higher than it is in other parts of the state. So I think again, that's why it's difficult to have a statewide number put on this. The legislature identified funds, earmarked funds for this. As Kip says, the legislature meets every year. If this problem isn't addressed adequately, they can certainly take it up again.
Are we going to eventually, gentlemen, have to look at the C word, consolidation in some form or another, as a way to free up money for teachers?
That's not the problem. That's not where. I mean, we haven't had I think the cost of living. If you look at the cost of living, teachers haven't had a raise in Indiana in a decade. That's they make less now than they made. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. They make less now, taking into account inflation, than they did a decade ago, and that doesn't have anything to do with anything other than we don't raise enough money to pay them. And schools aren't out there wasting dollars to a great extent. And if you look at the major metropolitan areas, you don't even have to think about consolidation. They've got the same problem as the rural and suburban schools and paying teachers. So consolidation it's kind of like saying, we're gonna save $100 here when we need 2,000. It's not going to make much difference in what the real problem is.
All right, let me get your thoughts. We'll take our quick break here.
I think consolidation has proven to not be good for the students, certainly. And you saw Hamilton Southeastern School District, they created a second high school. I don't think you're going to see a lot of consolidation in the future because, to Kip's point, you don't see a lot of savings. There's a little bit, but that doesn't trickle down to the teachers. It doesn't solve the teacher issue. So if you're doing what's best for children and educating children, no. Smaller class sizes, smaller building sizes benefit the children more.
You are watching Indiana Issues. Our guests today are Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Democrat Kip 2, and Republican Kyle Walker. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about gaming and also some of the bills that didn't make it out of the first half. Do they have a chance at life in the second half of the legislature? You're watching Indiana Issues, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our guests today are Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Democrat Kip 2, and Republican Kyle Walker, as we're talking about the big issues facing the state of Indiana. Gentlemen, another big issue at the legislature, the issue of gaming. What has been called possibly the biggest rewrite of Indiana's gaming law since gaming first came here in the 1990s. The Senate passed a rewrite of the bill. Allows for sports betting, allows for the movement of a couple of casinos, one from Gary to Terre Haute, and then move another casino in the Gary area, live table dealers at some places. Kip, there's been some talk in the hallways about maybe this bill, something needs to be maybe broken up to be managed a little bit more. What do you see? What are you hearing out there?
Well, as a veteran of the legislature, I don't think this issue is even in first gear yet. When conference committee time comes is when the real deals get cut and what we'll ultimately see. And then we're still a month away from conference committee time. I think we'll still be talking about what this is going to do. And I think part of what you're seeing happening is the House needs some leverage for some other things, and so they're using gaming as leverage. What passed the Senate is what some people's wish list is. But you have to understand, whenever you do, and I think you understand this, whenever you sort of change any of the structures of gaming, it affects other portions of the gaming industry, and they all compete with each other, and they all have folks at the General Assembly fighting for them, and so it's kind of like pushing the proverbial balloon. It's going to manifest itself in a different way, and so balancing those interests is a tough thing for the legislature to do. I think they're going to end up doing it well. The one prediction I'll make for sure is I do believe that we're going to get sports betting in the state of Indiana out of this bill at the end of the day. I don't know what the rest of it's going to look like yet, but I think that's going to be in there.
Brad, let me ask you, because that's one thing that when the speaker would do his media availabilities with us in the press, he'd talk about that. If you move something one place, it's like turning a bunch of dials. One dial here, it may not turn all the dials, but it may turn some, and then you've got this sort of delicate balance going on.
There is a delicate balance. I certainly think the legislature over the past few years, and they certainly pick winners and losers when it comes to gaming. There's one gaming interest here in Indiana that seems to control the gaming conversation. I'm not quite sure why they have so much influence, but they do.
They're the only local. I think that's one of the reasons.
And you know what? I guess I'm all for supporting locals, but on the other hand, there's a couple thousand bar owners out there that have been fighting to get video gaming terminals, and they're all local by definition, and they're not getting any run at all. So I don't know. I'm one that I kind of believe in the Nevada model of you submit your application fee, you turn your documents in, the state does a background check, and you know what? As long as you pass that, there can be as many gaming facilities as they want out there.
Well, that's certainly one model, but it's not one that Indiana wanted to do from the very start of gaming. They did not want to be Nevada. I mean, I think it was a very deliberate. We're going to allow gaming, but we're going to heavily regulate it and limit it to places. And as we've progressed over the last 20 years, there's been a little bit of relaxation of that, but we still only have so many licenses. We've only added 3 licenses since then.
Now, let me get you in this, Kyle, because one of the big things that always pops up is, quote unquote, are we doing sort of an expansion of gaming? It seems that in the most recent Senate version, if it is an expansion of gaming, it's got overwhelming support to go ahead and expand gaming by moving it down to Terre Haute, and once again moving that license that's up in Northwest Indiana, a little bit closer, more of a downtown metropolitan area.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly some folks, particularly in the House, that view this as an expansion. I think it's debatable whether it truly is. I mean, if you look at Terre Haute, it's an underutilized market that we would really draw a lot of their clientele and dollars from Illinois. If they don't do it in Terre Haute, it's likely that Illinois will do something in that area that will capture those dollars. And so, but to your exact question made about expansion, I personally don't view it as an expansion. I think that the House will probably make some changes to this, and to Kip's point, that it sort of reshuffles the balance of things, and so you have to take into consideration one of the biggest considerations is the hold harmless subsidies, and to your point about winners and losers. I mean, that's how they offset that balance when they make a change. So that folks like the owners of French Lick Casino can feel like they can maintain their competitiveness.
The one thing that I think that it's hard to argue that it isn't an expansion of gaming is that the adding sports betting. Now, it's illegal in the state of Indiana. A whole lot of it goes on, but bringing it under the legal side is certainly going to expand legalized gaming in the state of Indiana. I don't think anybody argues that point, that's going to be, but it doesn't really bring in all that much more revenue to the state. It brings in some, but not all that much more. But it will expand legal options to gamble in the state of Indiana.
And but oddly enough, that's not been the sticking point.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was going to say. I
fair
thought it was
point.
interesting. The thing that's sort of new and really is expanding gaming, which is the sports betting. Everybody's like, okay, everybody's doing it. It's here. We may as well get a cut. But when it comes to casinos, all right, now we got to have a more thoughtful, detailed conversation. Brad, let me get you to jump in real quick here.
I agree. I mean, it's been a foregone conclusion that sports betting is going to happen. And I haven't followed it closely enough to see if they're looking at doing it at the off-track betting facilities like they have in downtown Indianapolis, and I think Fort Wayne still has one. So that might change it a little bit. I think as far as the 2 Gary casinos, right now they share the same parking lot. So, there's effectively it's one facility that's using 2 licenses. So I've got no problem with letting it go to Terre Haute. Frankly, I've got no problem with letting it go wherever they want to put it. But if Terre Haute's where they decide they're going to put one, at least it makes sense to Kyle's point that there's a population in Illinois that's in the vicinity of that license. I think would generate more money for the state.
I don't think Terre Haute's the sticking point. I think the sticking point is moving the license down to the interstate in Lake County, because that really affects more boats up there. Now French Lick may have an argument with me about whether Terre Haute and Evansville may argue about moving it to Terre Haute, but I think the effect is less on them than it is on the boats up in northern Indiana along the lake, and having that license move to the interstate obviously makes it much more valuable. It makes it easier for people to get to. It gets the Illinois crowd more than it does where the boat is currently located, and obviously everybody knows that, because that's why there's opposition to it moving. So it does. So in that case, I think that's sort of the politics around it, or the public policy around it.
You're watching Indiana Issues, where we're talking about the issues facing the state of Indiana. Our guests are Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Democrat Kip 2, and Republican Kyle Walker. Gentlemen, we got just a few minutes left here on the program. Obviously, when we get to sort of past the halfway point, there are some bills that maybe die in a chamber, or maybe just sort of sit in limbo for a while, but may get a second chance. Some things that didn't get out, things like redistricting, things like medical marijuana. You gentlemen see anything out there that's maybe sort of sitting around that will probably be back a little bit later?
I wish legalization of marijuana was going to be back. I think we're behind the times, so to speak. And Michigan's going to legalize it, or has legalized it. It's going to be effective here very soon. Illinois has got what I would call a relaxed medical marijuana.
A very relaxed medical.
And so we're losing it. I mean, it's funny. We were, as a state, we were on the forefront when it came to gaming. Most people say Indiana's behind the times all the time. And we definitely are on marijuana, but we were ahead of it in gaming. I've never quite understood why gaming was fine to do, but not legalizing marijuana. It's so silly that we don't have it legalized when it's coming across the country. And I think the governor's making a big mistake by continuing the stand that he has, that he wants to wait till everybody else does it.
I look at medical marijuana at kind of like cross-county banking 30 years ago. Indiana was maybe 5 years behind the rest of the country on allowing banks to kind of spread out, but just that small window allowed other banks outside of the state to amass the capital to take over most of the banks that were domiciled here in Indiana, which is why Indiana is not a big player in the banking industry. I think medical marijuana is going to be the same thing, that you're going to have enough companies that are going to develop in other states that it's going to be almost impossible for Hoosiers to really get their toe into that market.
Well, to that point, I mean, it's going to be a regulated industry, and so certainly if and when the legislature decides to take up the issue, which I don't think will be this year,
You're right.
They can certainly put in provisions that will allow us to maintain competitiveness on that. But no, I don't think that nor the redistricting is going to get much traction over there for the remainder of the term.
It's interesting, particularly with the medical marijuana issue, because I could see. I may not necessarily agree with, but I understand the governor's position. Hey, you know what? It's not legal at the federal level, so why are we bothering to go down this road? But at the very least, put sort of an infrastructure in place. So when that day comes, which it's inevitable, it's going to happen. Indiana isn't trying to play catch up anymore. You've already got the infrastructure in place, for licensing, for distribution. You have 35 states that each have a system of how this stuff works. That it just seems to me that. It's wasted opportunity. If you're not going to legalize it, fine, but at least prepare for the day when legalization gets here.
I'd like to ask Kyle a question, and I hate to put you on the spot, but
No, you
it
don't.
must be it may not be fair, and I want to be fair, but it must be in Republican primary voting. When you look at polling, it must still be seen as by a certain percentage of your electorate as a bunch of hippies trying to sit around and smoke pot, because statewide polls show overwhelming support to legalize, and certainly in my party, it's like a no-brainer. I don't know hardly anybody who's opposed to it, so I'm trying to figure out why it is that the Republican Party in the state of Indiana, and the governor in particular, is opposed to getting this done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of folks around the state, right? And all politics is local, so I mean, I do think part of that is the voices that the legislators hear. Predominantly on this particular issue, are not supportive of legalizing marijuana at this time. Now, do I think that will evolve over time? I do, and I think it's already evolved.
Do you think it's, I guess the particular question I have, do you think it's a vestige of the 60s and people looking at the only people that smoked pot were the hippies and the dropouts and the people that are opposed to the Vietnam War, and they still look at it, this is liberal, we don't want anything liberal?
Maybe. I mean, I'm sure there's probably some folks that fall into that category, but I think predominantly too, there are probably large swaths of both in geography and politically of folks that don't know anyone that smokes marijuana or partakes in marijuana, edibles or whatever.
They're probably not talking to each other.
Or they don't know about
Yeah, we're almost out of time, Jim. We got to jump ahead real quick here. Quickly get to our predictions, prognostications. What do you all see in your crystal balls and in the political ether that folks should pay attention to? Brad, we'll start with you.
I think it's going to be somewhat of an unremarkable session. Obviously, it'll get busy the last 2 weeks like it always does, but they'll probably do something. Certainly sports betting is going to pass. I'm not sure where they're going to come out with the hate crimes legislation, but I don't think you're going to see anything earth-shattering.
Yep.
I don't have a prediction for the General Assembly. I think it's going to be pretty much the way it has been in every other budget year. I will say I think that what's exciting going to come up, the 5th Congressional District, I think is going to be something that everybody's going to be paying a lot of attention to within the next 6 months.
Kyle?
There's going to be and already starting a substantial push to change the smoking age in Indiana from 18 to 21, and the sort of the odd nature of this one is that the tobacco companies are actually part of the push to make that change. So I think it'll be interesting to watch.
look for Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill to get not one but possibly two challengers at his convention next week for Attorney General. That is going to do
year,
it
not next week.
next year in 2020. That is going to do it for the program today. Our guests have been Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Democrat Kip Tu, and Republican Kyle Walker. Thank you all very much for being with us. Big thanks to our friends at Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. You've been watching Indiana Issues. We'll see you next time on Indiana Issues.
That was pretty easy.